Thank you, Partha and Joy, for this extremely. It's really humbling. It's really indeed an honor and very humbling to be invited to deliver the third Northeast Water lecture for a very personal and an emotional reason, because it was, as Joy said, the first lecture of this series was delivered by Mr. Ramaswamy Iyer, a man of so many distinctions, and above all, a very dear, cherished senior colleague of mine at CPR, besides being the former secretary of the Water Resources Ministry, a person who drafted India's first national water policy, and has produced this vast, formidable corpus of water, on water. And what I find really remarkable about him is the courage which he has really shown to walk away from what were very entrenched positions that he had taken, and to kind of, just on the basis of his conviction, he had the courage to basically press pause and reflect and realize that he may have framed issues wrongly. And then he's, as I said, what I find remarkable in him is that courage that he showed to walk away. And it makes me wonder how many of us would have a sort of similar courage to do a U-turn in our own intellectual journeys, if at all we would kind of press pause and even admit we may have got the framing wrong. Thanks, Partha and Joy, once again for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts with you. And so formally also a big thanks to Aaranyak as well as the forum for inviting me. The topic of my talk today, as Partha mentioned, is flows and flaws, and looking at diverting the debate on Brahmaputra. Essentially, what it tries to, the central argument I try to make is that the India-China conversation on water has tended to unwittingly become a single issue debate, which is obsessed and become fixated on diversion. On whether we are obsessed over whether China will China divert the waters or not, and it's inadvertently, as I said, become a single issue debate. But is that all there is to it? So I go on to argue that there is an entire missing agenda, a set of missing issues that remain completely invisible that are rendered invisible to the mainstream research and policy imagination because of our complete preoccupation and obsession with diversion as the single issue. So what I've done is, in my presentation, is to divide it into three broad sections. First is to look at the idea of Brahmaputra. Whose imagined river is it? So that is, I thought, just to capture some of the many identities that this mighty river has. And then to go on to look at three instances and three examples of flawed framings. Three examples where India framed the issue on water wrongly and went on to pay the cost for that. And the third is to look at what I mentioned earlier, three examples of issues that remain missing from the India-China conversation on water. So those are the three that I think I'll go through. So to begin with the idea of Brahmaputra, as I said, whose imagined river is it? So the reason I thought this is an important lens to kind of try and understand the river is also because metaphors are very powerful instruments and very powerful tools. They tend to stick and they tend to capture the imagination. They also become very powerful vectors through which we understand and observe reality. So, and they also, for the same reason, because they are powerful tools, they are also they are dangerous, because we can also, as I said, I've mentioned in my in our interventions earlier today and yesterday, the power to frame is also the power to distort. So some of those frames then eventually effectively become reality. So this is the reason why I thought it might be a good idea to look at what the idea of Brahmaputra is. So if you were to answer the question whose imagined river it is, it really depends on whom you are talking to or whom you are asking. For instance, if you were to ask a hydro engineer, he or she might most likely be fascinated at the prospect of harnessing the tremendous hydro power potential of the river, estimated at something like 200,000 megawatts. If you were to ask a hydrologist, he or she is likely to be lost in calculations of Q-secs and flow rates and discharge volumes. But if you were to ask, for instance, a Tibetan, the Yarlung Tsangpo is a holy river which is part of a sacred landscape, and it's part of it's the river that in the Tibetan imagination, in the Tibetan social imagination, connects the sacred land of Pemako to Tibet's holiest mountain, that is Mount Kailash. So you see, each of these imageries captures a slice of the multiple identities that the Brahmaputra has, but doesn't quite capture its entire essence. And so it's more like the proverbial the blind man and the elephant. Each one is able to capture an essence, but it doesn't make it quite the whole. So from the tangible to the intangible, from the material to the metaphysical, you see this mighty river with its multiple identities as it traverses from the heights of 18,000 feet up in the Chenmayundung glaciers in Tibet, as it and traverses all the way to the Bay of Bengal. So the long and short of what I'm trying to say is that you can see how privileging any one single identity to what is actually this multi-dimensional river it strips away the complex layers from the Brahmaputra, and it reduces it in present, for instance, in the present imagination, it reduces it to being just a giant repository of water, and or to almost becoming, if one were be a little facetious, to being just an overground sort of water tank. So and then it's that's the first argument that I wanted to share. The second is to look at, as I said, three flawed frames, three examples where India frames the issue on water wrongly and then goes on to pay the costs of wrong, flawed frames. The first example is that of the 1950 Assam earthquake and floods, which created this massive destruction. It was an, I think, 8.6 magnitude earthquake, which resulted in this wall of water, which was apparently 30 feet high, took several villages in its wake. But as evidence later on goes on to show, especially the study by Angus MacLeod Gunn, shows that the 1950 Assam earthquake was not an Indian earthquake, but it had its origin in its epicenter in a place called Rima in southeast Tibet. So what mainstream research and policy for a goodish while believed was an Indian earthquake was actually a transboundary disaster. And so that's the first example. And because even though its epicenter was in Tibet, it was the Brahmaputra valley that went on to face the maximum, that bore the brunt of the damage. And the takeaway for us is this fundamental error in framing the issue. The second example is that of a 2000 flood. In 2000 you had the flash floods in Himachal and in Arunachal. There, even though we understood that the framing was right, but we were completely incapable of leveraging this framing to prevent extensive loss of property and lives. So the reason why we are not able to leverage the framing to our benefit was because we simply did not have any institutional mechanisms for information sharing and advanced warning with China. It is only subsequent to the 2000 floods that you have an agreement in 2002 and 2008 and so on, where you have information sharing agreements that get institutionalized with China. The third example is a most recent one, is the phenomenon of the Black Brahmaputra, where you had where the waters of the Brahmaputra, as all of you know, turned completely turbid, black and muddy, and there was this furious speculation of China being, the cause and the trigger for this, and there's this furious speculation of a 600-kilometer long tunnel being built by China from Yunnan through the Taklamakan desert in Xinjiang. So, but as facts and evidence proved that it was actually a 6.9 magnitude earthquake in Tibet, which actually resulted in landslide and the muddying of the waters. Now, even if China was not, so we framed it as that we held China responsible, but the point I want to make is, even if China is not, even if China was not the cause and it was a natural, it was due to natural effects, there is also a China factor that we need to kind of remember, because many of these, as I said, information sharing agreements in a transboundary basin simply cannot work without coordination. So to that extent, we need to bring China into the conversation, and so I think these are the three examples of flawed frames that I wanted to share with you. And then I'd like to look at, as I said, three missing issues that India has, because of its fixation with quantity, has failed to put on the table of the India-China water conversation. And the first one of these is the issue of water quality. And water quality, even within China, is turning out to be a major issue of concern, even within their own, south to north water transfer, plan that China has. Cities like Beijing and Shanghai have simply refused to take the water which is arriving from the south because of serious concerns with water quality and pollution. And what is also an added issue of concern is that there is research by Chinese scientists which show that there is evidence of tailings and heavy metals because of this furious pace of industrialization that Tibet is undergoing, and because of mining activities upstream. Research by Chinese scientists have shown that many of these are finding their way downstream. So despite this, it baffles the mind that water quality and issues of pollution are simply not tabled on the India-China agenda. It's just, it just remains, as I said, a single issue debate. The second issue similarly is that of which it fails to find a mention, is that of the possibility of dam-induced earthquakes. Again, Chinese research by Chinese scientists show that the 2008 devastating earthquake that happened in Sichuan in southwestern China, research by Chinese scientists traced this to the Sipingpu dam in Sichuan province. So there is this direct link. The Chinese scientists are alerting Beijing of this correlation between dam safety and earthquakes. And the Sichuan, the earthquake of 2008 claimed 80,000 lives. So it's baffling again when you see that the Himalayas has a recorded history of earthquakes going up to about 13th century. So it's not really surprising, and it's not something that it again baffles the mind about why we fail to or we simply don't. It's hiding in plain sight, yet we don't we don't add this to the agenda. The third is really the issue of cumulative impact. So right now, as of now, there is this feel-good narrative, very benign narrative coming out of China and the Indian official Indian discourse of the Chinese dams being run-of-the-river projects. So, but if you were to again look at the extensive literature questioning the effects of run-of-the-river projects, you see. So, for instance, there are about 38 run-of-the-river projects that the interministerial expert group has said are being planned in China. What would be the cumulative impact of a set of a bunch of such RORs on a river? And if you look, a quick example would be to see the there's this example of Pakmun Dam in Thailand, which again was built as a standard. It's a World Bank supported dam, which is officially labeled as a run-of-the-river project, but for most of its working life functioned virtually as a storage dam, and went on to, within its short life, went on to practically destroy Southeast Asia's aquatic life. So there is this, again, you really need to question some of this feel-good narrative around RORs and the kind of implications these would have. So, so just to then conclude, so what's wrong with the India-China conversation on the Brahmaputra? One, it is not institutionalized. When the former Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh mentioned to the Chinese president the need for a India-China water treaty, he was publicly snubbed. And this was carried in the papers that the Chinese president said that the present arrangements are very satisfactory and there is no need for a treaty to be signed. So the lack of institutionalization of the India-China arrangements on water. The second is also, I mentioned this to some of you yesterday, is a transactional notion of reciprocity that India seems to be adhering to, which completely is at odds with its own interests on a issue like Brahmaputra, where, for instance, the transactional notion of reciprocity works like this. On the Brahmaputra, for instance, the information sharing agreements that I mentioned are based on a commercial transaction between India and China, where India pays China 82 lakhs annually for China to fetch data, flood data from three stations in Tibet. So the problem that I have with this kind of when you reduce something called which one, it undercuts the idea of water, transboundary waters as a regional public good. Two, it's susceptible to it is simply because it's a commercial bargain or a commercial transaction, it is susceptible to collapse or pressure, for instance. And in 2017 when Doklam happened, it just required just that one crisis for this arrangement to completely come to a grinding halt, where China very pointedly refused to share the flood data for 2017 on citing technical grounds, but went ahead and shared the same data with Bangladesh. So, and nobody at least formally called China out. I mean, this is again China. So that's the. So the final thought is, if location gives the upper riparian a unique advantage, that is, i.e. China, I think it also gives the upper riparian the responsibility to address regional sentiment on a shared transboundary resource. And to the extent that China does only, and if you were to look at the Mekong, regional cooperation as an example, you have the Mekong countries being quite effective in trying to get a range of, or let's say they've been able to get tangible measures, for instance, like getting dry season flow data, getting site visits, so to these dam sites. So there are shifts in China's public policy, public diplomacy on the Mekong as a result of the manner in which Mekong countries have leveraged or have engaged with China. And so again, so the question is, why has India been unable to make its own case? So I think I'll leave you with that teaser.